Hi folks, welcome to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales. I am Bernette and I am happy you joined me today. Enjoy the show. Before we begin, I want you to picture a courtroom where the defendant cannot breathe. Not because he is nervous, not because the sentence has frightened him, but because he has been dead for months. Hi all, Bernette here, and welcome to the podcast. Tonight, I am taking you into one of the strangest and darkest trials in history. A trial where a pope ordered another pope pulled from the grave, dressed in sacred robes, placed on a throne, and judged in front of the living. This is not just a story about a corpse. It is a story about power, revenge, fear, and what happens when a ruler becomes so desperate to control the past that even death is not allowed to be silent. This is the Cadaver Synod. Let me take you somewhere uncomfortable. Not to the Rome of marble fountains and sunlit rooms, but to a colder room, a room of locked doors, candle smoke, muttered prayers, and men who understand that power could be holier than mercy if you dress it correctly. It is the year 897, and I want you to imagine the sound first, the scrape of stone, the hush of frightened clergy, and somewhere beneath the floor, a grave being opened. I keep seeing Pope Stephen VI before it happens, not raging, not yet, just sitting in the half light, too still to be calm. Around him, his advisors wait for the command they already know is coming. Nobody wants to be the first to say the obvious. Holy Father, this is madness. But Stephen lets the silence stretch until it becomes obedience. Then he says, "Bring him up." A cleric stares at him. "You mean Formosus?" Stephen's eyes do not move. "I mean the body." And there it is. The moment the room changes, the dead are not supposed to receive summonses. Graves are not supposed to answer subpoenas. But Stephen wants more than a judgment. He wants a scene. He wants Rome to watch a dead pope lose. Now I need to be clear with you. History does not preserve Stephen's private words for us. We do not have a transcript for that room, but the order itself was real. Formosus was exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, placed on a throne, and tried. So when I imagine Stephen saying, if he would not answer in life, he will answer in death, I am not pretending to quote a record. I am listening to what the act itself seems to say. Because that is what haunts me. Not only the corpse, the usefulness of the corpse. A living man can interrupt you. A living man can plead, contradict, accuse, weep, deny. But a dead man gives you the silence you need. And in Stephen's Rome, silence could be shaped into guilt. Pope Formosus had been dead for months, buried, finished, removed, or so people thought, from the reach of politics. But Stephen did not want him gone. He wanted him displayed. He wanted him accused. He wanted the whole city to watch the old pope's memory dragged back into the light and broken in public. So stay with me. I'm not going to give you this as a tidy documentary timeline. I want to walk it like a chapter in a dark novel. I want to stand in the room before the order is given, follow the men down to the tomb, enter the courtroom with the body, and listen for the things no one was brave enough to say aloud. And as I tell it, I keep asking myself one question: what kind of power is so afraid of a dead man that it orders the grave opened? Every story has a door you should not open. In this one, it is a tomb. And the closer I get to it, the more I feel the pressure building, the grudges, the fractions, the fear of old decisions still having power, the kind of fear that makes living man look at a grave and see an enemy. I hear the city before I understand it, a servant whispering in the corridor, "They say the Pope will judge Formosa," and another voice answering, "Formosa is dead." Then the first voice, lower now, "That is what frightens me." Rome is holding its breath, and Stephen knows it. He wants that breath. He wants that dread. He wants the whole city leaning toward the sound of the grave opening. And that is why this feels less like a trial and more like a confession made by power itself. Someone planned the hour. Someone chose the vestments. Someone prepared the throne. Someone said, "Open the grave." And someone else, perhaps with a hand trembling around a lamp, answered, "If we do this, Holy Father, we cannot undo it." Stephen's answer comes to me like a blade being drawn. Then do it properly. Before the tomb, there is always the motive. And when I look at Stephen's room, I do not see peace. I see a city with its teeth clenched. Bishops maneuver like couriers. Nobles make prayers that sound like threats. Kings hover at the edge of every decision. In that world, even a blessing can become evidence, and even a dead man can remain politically dangerous. Pope Formosus was not a ghost who appeared suddenly at the center of this nightmare. He had been the Bishop of Porto. He had served as a diplomat. He had dealt with kings and missions and dangerous men who remembered every slight. In Rome, influence was never neutral. It made people seek out, and it made others wait for the day you could be destroyed. I imagine Pope Formosus in a life as a man who understood the danger, but kept moving through it anyway. Perhaps he told himself, "I can survive this. I have survived worse." Well, perhaps when he looked at Rome, he saw not just enemies, but a board of pieces he could still move. And here is the part I do not want to lose in the shadow of the cross. Pope Formosus was not merely hated, he was admired. Before he became a symbol to be mutilated, he had been a man people trusted with delicate missions. Pope Nicholas I had sent him to Bulgaria as a papal legate, and by many accounts, he was effective enough there that the Bulgarian ruler Boris wanted him as archbishop. That tells me something. People do not ask for a distant churchman to lead them unless he has made them believe he can guide, organize, and protect them. To understand what Nicholas I did for Formosus, I have to pause the story and step back into the earlier Rome of the 860s. Nicholas I was not a quiet pope. He believed the papacy should stand above kings when question of faith, morals, marriage, church order, and spiritual authority were at stake. In his time, Rome was not merely praying over Europe, Rome was arguing with it. Kings tested the Pope. Bishops resisted him. Constantinople watched him. Bulgaria pulled him into a contest between East and West. And Nicholas, instead of shrinking, pushed back. I imagine Nicholas looking at Pope Formosus before the Bulgarian mission, measuring him the way powerful men measure useful men. Bulgaria is not a small errand, Nicholas I might have said. Boris is choosing not only a faith, but an allegiance. Constantinople wants him. Rome must not lose him. Formosus bows, but Nicholas keeps speaking. You will not go as a tourist of doctrine. You will go as the voice of Rome. Every answer you give will be heard in Constantinople. Every gesture might be read by king. Formosus lifted his eyes. Then I must be careful. Nicholas answers, no, you must be careful and bold. Rome cannot send a timid man into a contested frontier. That mission mattered because Bulgaria was newly christening and caught between two great religious centers, Rome and Constantinople. Boris wanted guidance, legitimacy, and enough independence to keep Bulgaria from becoming merely another province of someone else's spiritual empire. Nicholas sent answers, books, church equipment, and legates, including Formosus, into that tense frontier. This was diplomacy dressed as salvation. Every Baptist carried politics inside it. Boris is important here because he was not simply a background ruler asking polite religious questions. He was playing a dangerous game of balance. If he accepted too much influence from Constantinople, Bulgaria risked being pulled into the Byzantine orbit. If he turned toward Rome, he gained another powerful center to bargain with. Boris wanted Christianity, yes, but he also wanted room to breathe. He wanted a Bulgarian church that would not simply become another arm of a foreign empire. I imagine Boris receiving Rome's envoys and studying Formosus closely. You come from Nicholas, Boris says, but do you understand Bulgaria? Formosus does not answer too quickly. He knows this is not only a question about language or custom, it is a question about survival. I understand that a ruler who accepts the faith must not lose his kingdom in the process, Formosus replies. And perhaps that is the moment Boris begins to trust him. That trust is what changes everything. Boris does not merely welcome Formosus, he wants to keep him. In that request, I hear both admiration and strategy. Let him remain, Boris might have told Rome. Let this man guide our church. He knows how to speak to us. But Rome hears another message. Beneath the praise, Formosus has become powerful beyond his assigned place. And Formosus succeeded. That is the dangerous part. He did not simply go to Bulgaria and disappear into paperwork. He impressed Boris. He became the man Boris wanted as archbishop. I imagine the Bulgarian ruler saying, "This one understands us. Leave him here. Let him guide our church." And somewhere in Rome, that request must have sounded like both praise and alarm. Praise because Nicholas had chosen well, alarm because Formosus had become valuable enough to be wanted. But Nicholas refused to let him become Archbishop of Bulgaria, not because Formosus had failed, but because the rules mattered, or at least had to appear to matter. A bishop was bound to his see, almost like a marriage, and Formosus already belonged to Porto. I imagine Nicholas calling him in after Boris' request arrives. The room is quieter than usual. He wants you, Nicholas says. Formosus does not smile. that Rome has been heard. Nicholas studies him. Too clearly, perhaps. Formosus stiffens. Holy Father? Nicholas' voice hardens, not with anger, but warning. You are Bishop of Porto. You do not become Bulgaria's Archbishop because a ruler admires you. If we bend the rules for success, our enemies will call it ambition. And that line matters later. It matters terribly because the charge Stephen would use against Formosus is in the Cadaver Synod, that he had abandoned one bishop and reached for another office, had roots in his oldest anxiety. Boris' admiration helped prove Formosus' brilliance, but it also made him look movable, desirable, maybe even hungry. Formosus might have answered Nicholas quietly, so my usefulness is now my danger. And Nicholas, if he had been honest, might have said, in Rome, my son, it often is. That is Nicholas' impact on him. He lifted Formosus into the dangerous air of high church politics. He made him visible. He trusted him with a mission that proved his skill. But that same success created the old suspicion that would later be sharpened into a weapon. Formosus had shown he could cross borders, persuade rulers, and make Rome matter in distant courts. To admirers, that made him exceptional. To enemies, it made him ambitious. I imagine the whispers around him sounding very different before the hatred hardened. Formosus knows kings, one cleric might have said. Formosus understands the Franks, another might have answered. He understands more than that. He knows how to make Rome matter beyond Rome. To supporters, that may have been his gift. He was not content to sit quietly while stronger men decided the future of the church from outside its walls. He moved, he negotiated, he looked beyond the city gates. That is why some people may have loved him, or at least respected him deeply. He had the air of a survivor and a strategist, someone who had been excommunicated, restored, sent abroad, trusted again, and still managed to rise. To ordinary believers, perhaps he looked like a steady hand in a shaking world. To clergies who valued experience, he looked seasoned. To political allies, he looked useful. And to his enemies, that same usefulness looked dangerous. When Formosus became Pope, his most explosive choice was political. He tried to free Rome from the grip of the Spartan rulers, Guy and Lambert. Instead of accepting their dominance, he looked to Arnulf of Carinthia, the East Frankish king, and invited him into the Italian struggle. In 896, Formosus crowned Adolf emperor. If I am Stephen or one of these Spartan men standing behind him, that is the policy I cannot forgive. Formosus had not merely chosen a side, he had blessed a rival claim to power. I imagine Stephen hearing the accusation repeated until it became a wound. He crowned Arnulf, someone says. He called a foreign sword into Italy, another voice added. He weakened Lambert. He humiliated Spurleton. He made our enemies legitimate, and beneath those political charges sat the church law charge Stephen would later weaponize. Formosus had once been Bishop of Porto, and his enemies accused him of unlawfully moving from that see into the papacy, of breaking the rule against a bishop abandoning one seat to seize another. That is what Stephen disliked. or at least what he could make useful. Pope Formosus' diplomacy, his alliance with Arnulf, his challenge to Spolitan power, his ordinations and decisions as Pope, his very legitimacy. If Formosa had been a true Pope, then his axe stood. If his axe stood, then his enemies had to live under the shadow of what he had done. So Stephen's task became a terrible and simple: make Formosa false, and everything Formosa touched could be called false with him. But the Spolitan faction watched him. They remembered that he had looked beyond them toward Arnulf of Corinthia, seeking a stronger hand to break their grip. To Formosa, it may have felt like survival. To his enemies, it looked like betrayal. I picture a Spolitan noble leaning close to Stephen, speaking in the careful voice of a man who wants another man to commit the sin for him. If Formosa remains legitimate, he says, that every insult he gave us remains a lie. So Stephen does not answer straight away. He watches the candle tremble. And if he is condemned, the noble asks. Stephen finally turns. Then his hand never blessed, his strength never held, his memory never stored. And this is where I feel the motive takes shape, not as a sudden crack in reason, but as something colder, a calculation, a need. If Pope Formosa had been wrong, then the men he raised could be lowered. The decisions he made could be poisoned. The political humiliations he caused could be avenged. Stephen was not chasing a ghost. He was trying to murder a legacy. I understand then that the Cadaver Synod, who's never only about rules, it was not simply theology, procedure, or some technical complaint about a bishop changing seats. It was power speaking in the language of law. It was revenge wearing a mitre. It was Stephen trying to reach backwards through death and tear Formosa out of history by the roots. I imagine a Spolitan noble pressing Stephen harder as the idea sharpened. If Formosa remains Pope in memory, then his choices remain a lie. Stephen looks towards the window where Rome lies restless and waiting. Then we will kill that memory, he replies. We show them he was never what he claimed to be. And here is where the emotional temperature of the room changes. Nobody says, this is revenge. They say, this is necessary. Nobody says, we are afraid of a dead man. They say, the church must be protected. That is how horror survives in respectable rooms. It learns to speak in clean sentences. Before I go into the crypt, I listen for calculation. I listen for the sentence that must have passed one mouth to another. The courtroom is ready. Then another voice. And the defendant? A pause. A glance toward the grave. The defendant is waiting, is the answer. And that is the horror beneath the horror. By the time the tomb is open, Stephen had already tried Formosa in his mind. The corpse is not being brought to court so justice can decide. The corpse is being brought to court so judgment can be performed. By January 897, the decision had hardened. I imagine the men gathered before Stephen as if they had been called to receive a sentence of their own. One keeps his eyes on the floor. Another presses his lips together until they whiten. Stephen looks at them one by one. He does not need to shout. Men like that rarely do. You know what must be done, he says. Open the tomb, Stephen says. In my telling, the words fall quietly, and somehow that makes them worse. Take Formosus from the earth, dress him as the Pope, seat him before me. A young cleric, too frightened to be wise, whispers, Holy Father, he is dead. Stephen's gaze moves to him. Then he has no more excuses. One advisor, older than the others, might have stepped forward, then just enough to be noticed and not enough to be accused. Holy Father, he says, Rome will not forget this. Stephen does not look away from him. Then let Rome remember it correctly. Another voice, almost swallowed by the room, and asks, and if the people call it sacrilege? Stephen's answer is quiet enough to terrify them. The people will call it what we teach them to call it. Well, I do not know if those words were his exact words. No one can honestly claim that. But the action speaks with brutal clarity. Stephen did not merely allow the exhumation, he caused it. He wanted the grave open, the corpse raised, the body clothed, the spectacle prepared. So we go down. At least that is how it feels when I tell it. I follow the lamps into the crypt. The air thickens, breath turns shallow. Nobody jokes. Nobody speaks about a murmur. Stone answers iron. The seal gives way. One priest closes his eyes and another hisses, Keep working. In that moment, obedience sounds exactly like fear. A young man at the edge of the crypt whispers, He was Pope. The priest beside him does not turn his head. Not tonight. What is it then? The answer becomes, after silence, evidence. Then they raise him, and this is where my stomach tightens every time, not because death is shocking, death is ordinary, but humiliation after death, humiliation planned, rehearsed, and given witnesses, that is different. They dress him again in papal vestments, and the robes do not restore his dignity. They turn dignity into evidence. They make holiness part of the accusation. One priest holds the vestment and whispers, Forgive us. Another snaps, Do not speak to him. Why not? The first says, barely breathing. Because if he hears us, the second answers, then God hears us too. Nobody replies after that. They lift the body, they arrange the robes, the stage is ready, and every man in the room knows he has helped build it. Now picture the courtroom with me, not as a painting, not as a footnote, just picture the smell of wax and old stone. Picture men trying not to look directly at the throne. Picture Formosus seated there in papal robes, a terrible stillness where a voice should be. Stephen sits opposite him, and for a moment the living and the dead seem to be waiting for each other to move. The deacon stands beside the corpse. Imagine being that man. Imagine being told, You will answer for him. He wants to protest. I know he does, because I can feel the protest trapped in his throat. But Stephen is watching. The bishops are watching. Rome is watching through every rumor that will leave this room. Speak when he is questioned, Stephen says. The deacon bows and thinks, if I choose the wrong word, I become the next lesson. Before the first question is asked, the deacon's mouth opens as if his body is trying to save him from his duty. Holy Father, he says, what answer can the dead give? Stephen's eyes move from Formosus to the deacon. The answer I permit. Stephen begins softly. Formosus, The name moves through the room like a draught. Why did you abandon the see of Porto? Why did you reach for the apostolic throne? Why did you presume to rule where you had no right? No one breathed easily. These are not questions. They are nails being placed before the hammer falls. A bishop near the wall murmurs, "This is not a trial." The man beside him answers without moving his lips, "Then be grateful you are not the defendant." The deacon answers because he has been ordered to answer. "I serve where the church required me," he says, for the dead man. Stephen's face tightens. "Do not dress ambition as service." The deacon lowers his eyes. Maybe he wants to say, "And what are you dressing this as? Justice?" But he swallows the thought. That is the emotional violence of the room. Everyone knows what cannot be spoken. This is the thought process I imagine inside Stephen. Not confusion, not madness in the simple sense, but strategy. If Formosus is guilty, then Formosus was never truly Pope. If he was never truly Pope, then his acts can be torn down. His ordinations can be challenged. His political choices can be made poisonous. Stephen is not prosecuting a corpse because he thinks the corpse will answer. He is prosecuting the memory. I can almost hear the men behind Stephen breathing carefully, each one measuring the course of disagreement. One bishop might think this is sacrilege. Another might think this is politics. Survive it. Another might simply stare at the dead pope and pray not to be noticed. Now, if this feels unbelievable, I remind myself that everyone in that room had a reason to keep going. The deacon wanted to survive the moment. The bishops wanted to avoid becoming the next target. Stephen wanted the verdict to sound inevitable. "Speak for him," Stephen tells the deacon, "but remember who hears you." And then Stephen leans forward and answers plainly. The deacon looks at the corpse, then back at Stephen. "I did what I believed was necessary." For one heartbeat, I imagine the room almost believes Formosus had spoken. Then Stephen cuts through it. "Necessary? No. Convenient? Ambitious? Treacherous?" The deacon goes pale. He has lent his voice to a dead man, and now the accusations feel as if it's crawling back towards him. The verdict is not delivered so much as released. Guilty, invalid, unmade, the words move through the room and change the temperature of it. Stephen's voice rises now as if he needs the stones themselves to remember. "Strip him. Void his acts. Let every blessing from that hand be nothing." For a moment, no one moves. Stephen turns his head slowly. "Did you not hear me?" A priest takes one step forward. "We heard." "Then strip him." Then they move toward Formosus, and this is the moment the room becomes almost unbearable. The trial was grotesque. The punishment was intimate. Hands reach for the vestments. Cloth is pulled away. The symbols of office are removed from the body that cannot defend even its own dignity. I imagine one bishop looking down at the hand afterwards, as if no longer belonged to him. And then the fingers, the blessing fingers, the fingers that had once moved over crowds, over clergy, over men who knelt and believed authority had passed through him. When they are not cut away, the message is not subtle. Stephen is saying, even if he never says it aloud, your blessings were lies, your authority was theft, your hand is no longer holy. But even that is not enough. Formosus is dressed like a layman, buried quickly, then dragged back out again and thrown into the Tiber River. The river takes him because Rome has decided the grave is too dignified. The water closes over him, but the story does not sink. By the time the body reaches the Tiber, Rome is already changing. I stand on the bank of my imagination and hear the river before I see it. Someone in the crowd whispers, "They threw him in." Another answers, "They threw themselves in with him." A third voice says, whatever someone feels and almost no one dares to say, this was not justice. This was fear dressed as judgment. Now this is where the story starts whispering back. If Stephen thought the river could carry the scandal away, he misjudged Rome. A woman at a doorway might have crossed herself and said, "They threw him into the water." A man beside her might have answered, "They threw more than him. They threw away shame." I imagine the room was traveling faster than any official degree. "Stephen has gone too far," someone says in the courtyard. "Careful," another warns. "Wolves have ears." But the first voice does not retreat. "Then let the wolves hear. Even the dead are not safe from him." And here is the turn, the part of the story that feels almost like fate taking a breath. Stephen has made his spectacle. He has forced the dead to sit trial. He has stripped the body, cut away the symbols, thrown the remains toward the river. He thinks he has controlled the meaning of the scene, but Rome takes the meaning back. I imagine Stephen noticing it in small ways at first. A corridor falling silent too quickly, a servant refusing to meet his eyes, a noble who used to bow warmly now bowing as if distance itself could protect him. Stephen tells himself, "They are weak. They needed me to do what they feared." But another thought presses in, unwelcome and cool. What if they are not afraid of Formosus anymore? What if they are afraid of me? One night, I imagine him stopping a servant in the doorway. "What do they say outside?" Stephen asks. The servant hesitates. "They say Rome has seen enough." Stephen steps closer. "Enough of Formosa?" The servant looks down. "Enough of you." This is the danger of theater. You can build the stage, you can choose the costume, you can force the actor to sit where you place him, even if that actor is dead, but you cannot control what the audience carries home in its stomach. Then the story closes around Stephen. The man who summoned the corpse is taken himself in prison, and by the end of 897, reportedly strangled in custody. I imagine the darkness around him then. No throne, no cord, no stage silence, only breath, panic, memory. Perhaps he hears the scrape of the tomb again. Perhaps at the very end, he understands that he did not bury Formosa, he buried himself beside him. Later, Formosa is restored to honor. His body is recovered and reburied at St. Peter's. The acts of the Cadaver Synod are condemned. But history does not forget because someone apologizes. History remembers because the wound was public. Even after later popes tried to repair the damage, I cannot pretend the story cleans itself up. The body is restored, yes. The synod is condemned, yes. But the image remains. A grave turned into a stage, a corpse turned into a defendant, and a pope discovering too late that spectacle can devour the man who commands it. What I cannot shake, and this is why I keep coming back to the story, is the loneliness of every person inside it. The corpse alone on the throne, the deacon alone with borrowed words in his mouth, the bishops alone inside their fear, even Stephen surrounded by power, alone with the terrible need to prove that a dead man could still be defeated. That is why this story feels uncomfortably close. Even across more than 1,000 years later, it is about power, trying to control memory. It is about a trial stage, not to discover the truth, but to manufacture it. It is about people sitting in a room, knowing something is wrong, and choosing silence because silence feels safer than courage. I think of Stephen's alleged fury, the pressure from the Spalatin faction, the clergy who may have obeyed through fear, the deacon forced to lend his voice to a cause, and the people of Rome watching the impossible becomes official. Every character in that room had a thought they could not safely say out loud. When I think of it like a crime, I ask the questions I cannot stop asking. Who benefited? Who feared the truth? Who controlled the room? Stephen sits as judge, but he is also witness, prosecutor, and playwright. The deacon speaks, but not freely. The bishops listen, but not safely. Formosus is silent, but his silence becomes the loudest thing there. That is what the Cadaver Synod reminds me of. History is not only made by battles and crowns. Sometimes it is made in rooms where people decide what memory is allowed to survive. One man says, "Erase him." Another obeys. A city watches, and the very act of erasing becomes the reason the story lasts. And this is where my mind drifts uncomfortably to that 1,000 years later, to Donald Trump. And I feel the hesitation in my own throat before I say it. Not because the stories are the same, they are not. One belongs to medieval Rome and a corpse on a throne and a pope trying to prosecute memory itself, and the other belongs to modern politics, cameras, rallies, loyalty tests, courtrooms, headlines, raised voices, clenched jaws, and the endless theater of power. But there is an emotional shape I cannot ignore, the hunger to control the story, the need to make people repeat one version of reality until repetition begins to sound like truth. The pressure on everyone nearby to keep speaking, defending, nodding, smiling, even when their faces start to look tired, even when the performance begins to cost them something private. When I think about Trump, I think about the pull of a man who makes loyalty feel like a test you can never finish. I think about people stepping closer and closer to the flame because for a while, warmth can feel like safety. Advisors, lawyers, officials, supporters, loyalists, each one perhaps telling themselves, I still have control. I still know where the line is. I can step back when I need to. But power rarely announces the moment it has taken hold of you. It does not always slam a door. Sometimes it simply asks for one statement, one more defense, one more public smile, one more silence while your conscience is standing in the corner, begging you to listen. That is the warning I hear in the Cadaver Synod, and it lands like a chill I cannot shake off. Stephen did not fall alone in the moral sense. He had men around him who opened the tomb, arranged the robes, guarded the room, obeyed the order, and swallowed the horror as if obedience could make it clean. When the spectacle turned rotten, they could not wash their hands, they say. We were only standing there. They had touched the story. They had helped stage the nightmare. And that makes me ask the modern question with a knot in my stomach. When Trump is no longer protected by power, what happens to the people who helped build the stage around him? Do they walk away untouched? Or does history remember every hand that held the lamp? every voice that repeated the lie, every face that stayed calm while something dangerous was being normalized. I do not know the answer, and that uncertainty is what makes the thought sit so heavily. I am not pretending history repeats itself neatly. It does not. It mutates. It changes clothes. It learns new languages. But power has a way of asking people for pieces of themselves until they look on and realize they have been given more than they're meant to be given. Their voices, their reputations, their judgment, their silence, and when the protection fades, when the crowd thins, when the throne is just a chair again, the people who stood nearest often discover the cruelest truth of all. Loyalty is not always a shield. Sometimes it is a receipt. Sometimes it is a fingerprint. Sometimes it is the thing history uses to identify you when the room finally goes quiet. So if you are listening to this in your bed, or walking with headphones, or sitting somewhere ordinary while I tell you something extraordinary, stay with this final image. Do not leave it at the river. Do not let the water close over it. Come back with me to the courtroom, to the throne, to the body dressed in robes it can no longer feel. Formosus sits there in terrible silence while Stephen stares at him as if victory is finally within reach. And beside them, the deacon stands with a voice that is not really his. Stephen wanted Rome to see a guilty man. Instead, Rome saw a frightened ruler trying to conquer a corpse. He wanted Formosus erased. Instead, he made him unforgettable. And that is the final irony, the kind history saves for its darkest chapters. The dead pope did not need to speak. Stephen spoke enough for both of them. And when I close the book on this chapter, I still hear it. Not a voice exactly, more like an echo moving through stone, through the basilica, through the crypt, through the river, and then finally through every room where power confuses fear for justice. The question waits there in the dark. What kind of man is so afraid of the dead that he puts a corpse on trial? And maybe that is where the story should leave us. Not with an answer, but with the sound of stone closing, a bell fading, and the uneasy knowledge that power is never more revealing than when it tries to silence what it fears. This has been the story of the Cadaver Synod, the trial of a dead pope, and the fear of a living one, and the warning history left behind in the dark. So folks, that's it. If this story made you think twice about what power does when no one dares to challenge it, then do me a favor. Follow the podcast, leave a rating, share this episode with someone who loves the bizarre, the dark, and the truth. And until next time, keep listening closely, because history does not always whisper from the past. Sometimes it scratches at the door.